Well, Eric, I appreciate you being with me here on the Social Entrepreneurship and Innovation podcast. And for folks who are unfamiliar, would you mind introducing yourself and sharing with us a little bit as to what it is that you do?
Sure, Corey. Well, let me first thank you for inviting me on your show. I'm really looking forward to it. So my name is Eric Nee. I'm the editor-in-chief at Stanford Social Innovation Review. I've been here since 2006, so for the last 14, 15 years. As editor-in-chief, I have a role in all of the content that we produce. We have a big team now, so I no longer spend much time actually editing articles, although that is the first thing in my title. But I have a group of people that I've hired who are very good at editing. When I first started here, it was a much smaller group. There were 3 people. Today we have 10 full-time people, which is still relatively small. About 6 of them on the editorial side and the other 4 on the publishing side. So we are, in some ways, a traditional media organization. We have the editor side, the publishing side. We sell subscriptions. We run conferences. We are part of Stanford University. Oftentimes people are a little confused about that. So, for example, like when we charge people to attend our conference, sometimes people say, like, well, you're part of Stanford University. They have, how many $1 billion in the bank? Why am I paying money? And we have to explain to them that, well, we get to use Stanford's name. They don't give us any funding. So as a result, we have to bring in all of our own funds, and we have basically an earned income model to do that. So I can go into more of that later, but I do oversee all the content. So all the articles that go into the magazine, all the articles that we publish online, the podcasts that we do, our webinars, et cetera.
Excellent. And so I'm curious a bit as to how you came to the Stanford Social Innovation Review originally. Tracking back your career a bit, as I mentioned, I was listening to some podcasts and interviews and stuff beforehand. I picked up this phrase from one, I think, webinar you did. You said you were a Marxist covering business in Silicon Valley for 15 years. So I
don't know if it's safe to say that in Texas, but California, you can get away with it. So before I became a journalist, I was quite active in what was then the New Left in America. I had grown up with the Vietnam War, was of draft age, became very aware of, what was going on in Vietnam, and then very critical of it. And then when I went to college, I began to take courses to try to understand a little bit better about why we were in Vietnam, why was there poverty in the U.S. amidst so much wealth, why was there so much conflict between, the industrialized countries and those that are less developed. And at that time, there was a lot. There were revolutionary movements all around the world. It wasn't just in Vietnam. So I ended up joining a socialist organization while I was in college, and then continued doing that after. And we were a democratic socialist organization. It was called New American Movement. And I ended up being on the executive committee. So I was very involved in labor organizing, political movements. But then I was working as a nurse's aide for several years, and after changing the 1,000th bedpan, I decided I need to do something a little more intellectually stimulating. So I went to journalism school, went to Northwestern, Medill, and my hopes was to go back and write about politics and labor and all that, but I ended up being in San Francisco, where I was from, and there weren't any jobs there. There was jobs covering Silicon Valley, because it was the personal computer was just being launched then, later the Macintosh. Of course, the internet was still something that was run by the Defense Department. It wasn't what it is today. But I found actually the technology interesting, the technology itself interesting, but also the technology industry. It wasn't what I had imagined. It was very creative. They actually did create products that added value to society. I mean, the Macintosh, you think about that. Um, they did pay their people well. In fact, they had what you might even call a form of wealth sharing, because most of the tech companies gave stock options
Mm.
to people. So it actually was capitalism that seemed to work, and it kind of surprised me. And so the more I covered it, the more I thought, wow, this is actually interesting. But I still held on to my feelings about social justice, right? Which the tech world doesn't directly address.
Mm.
So I ended up working at Forbes magazine and Fortune magazine, and covering the Silicon Valley world. But after the dot-com crash, around 99, 2000, I ended up leaving Fortune and eventually found my way to Stanford. And I found this publication that had already been started, Stanford Social Innovation Review, which I thought was the perfect fit for me, because it was looking at innovations, social innovations, right? Ways that you can change, improve society, but new ways, and sometimes incorporating business models and earned income models, and really using all the tools that one has to try to improve society. So it kind of brought both my really kind of expertise in technology and business, along with my experience in social justice and economic equality and political democracy together in a way that I had frankly never thought I could do.
Mm.
So that's why I've stayed here so long, 15 years. I've never had a job. I don't know about many people in your audience. Before that, the longest job I ever had was like 4 years or something, because I like to bounce around. But this really was, for me, the perfect job. And at 2006, when I joined, the term social innovation was really not that widely used. Like, a lot of people, you had to explain to people what it meant.
Mm-hmm.
If you talked about, we write stories about nonprofits and foundations, people kind of get that. But then when you talk about, business being a force for social good, that was a little confusing, because back then, there was Ben and Jerry's, but beyond that, it was kind of, big companies had, parts of their organization that would look at uh, social issues, but more from a compliance standpoint, like how do we make sure
CSR
that we're inviting,
programs.
yeah. But
Mm.
it wasn't really proactive and really thinking creatively. But I'd say, and it's not because of us. I'd like to claim that it was, but I'd say, over the last 15 years, there's been a big change. Many businesses have kind of come around on this issue. Many people with wealth are more interested now as interested in how they give away their money as they were in how they made it.
Mm.
A lot of young people from colleges are looking at how to create social change organizations right, in college. When I was young, it was the real alternative was like get out in the streets and protest. Well, we're seeing a lot of that now, and that's not unimportant. But at a certain stage, you got to take protest into policy and programs. You can't, and we're seeing that happen pretty quickly now, actually. People are moving to, like, how do we reform the criminal justice system and policing, right? Which I think's great. But, young people are really interested in that now in school. So, I mean, it's really been a treat to be the editor these years, because it's, I'd say we're riding this wave.
Mm.
We're helping, sort of build the wave, I think, but we're also really riding this wave that's happening in the US, but also happening globally.
Mm-hmm. And I'm curious too, as to like why journalism and media. Like, what do you think generally has appealed to you as to what sort of role it fits in the scheme of impacting
Yeah,
change?
interesting question. So I've always been kind of an intellectual person. I love reading, and one of my favorite classes in high school is debate, and the organization, New American Movement, that I joined was very much kind of an intellectual approach to social change. So for me, journalism was kind of a natural fit,
Mm.
because it allowed me to explore ideas and explore what's going on in the world. and then write about it and share it with other people, because I wasn't really ever attracted to the academic world. My dad was a professor, so I mean, I knew it, but I didn't want to spend, years and years working on some research project or
Mm.
thesis or book. I'm somebody that's inclined more toward action, but action that has, thought and theory backing it up. So journalism, people describe it as, kind of the first, let's say the first attempt to, understand history. And so, but I've always been attracted to more kind of the long form analytical journalism. So my dream was, as a business journalist, to get to Fortune, because that was really, they were known for that, doing long form articles and, as opposed to news.
Mm.
But I love journalism. I do think it plays an important role, particularly in the social sector, because if we're going to figure out how to really change society, you have to understand what we've done in the past. What have we tried that worked? What hasn't worked? And bringing the voices of the people who are doing that work, to one another, so they can learn from each other. And so journalism and publishing is a great way to do that. It's not the only way. I mean, there's a lot of learning that takes place just peer to peer. People sit down and they talk. There's books, of course, which are really important. But I think a publication like SSIR, where we write pretty in-depth articles on topics, we have webinars, conferences, I think is a really serves an important tool in helping people do their jobs better. So we've always looked at our role as providing a critical perspective on social innovation. And it's an important distinction. When I first started, we ran an article on Grameen Bank. Mm. And this was right at the time that Muhammad Yunus was awarded the Nobel Prize for his work. And it was a critical article that said, while microfinance and microlending is important, it's not something that is by itself going to lift huge numbers of people out of poverty. And there was a whole critical analysis about that I won't go into. And I think it's turned out to be true, right? That, if you look at China, and not to say China has a lot of problems, but, getting a lot of people jobs and working in industry and building up businesses where people, are able to, that's the way to kind of really lift people out of poverty, rather than thinking that every single person is going to be an entrepreneur and having, their own little kind of shoe repair shop in the back of their house. And so we got a lot of blowback on that article, and people saying, like, I thought you were supporting social innovation. Why are you tearing it down? It's like, you don't understand. We are all about bringing forth new ideas of how to improve society. So we did write, let's say, stories that talked about microfinance and all the important things that it can do. But then it's also important to reflect on, is it working? What part of it works? What doesn't work? And often people don't want to do that. They don't want to hear things like, that's a nice idea, but, it could be improved upon. And so, but that is the role we play. And I think of it sometimes as being a coach, right? I mean, you have to know when to bring, encourage people, inspire people, on the team, if you want to think of it as a team, right? To do good things. But then you also, if you're a real coach, you can't just like be, it's the difference between a coach and a cheerleader, right? So, I mean, a coach is also going to get in there and tell you, like, this is not working, right? Or you need to improve this, or think about that. So that is really the role that we play. And I think it's an important one.
Mm. Yeah, and it seems to make sense and be quite fitting. I think I mentioned, or I heard you mention as well that SSIR is unique in that it's like a peer-to-peer publication that you had. I don't know if it's exactly the same today as when I heard you refer to it this way, but professionals in the field are contributors as well as they're the audience of folks consuming the publication and all the different content. So you would hope that it isn't just, you know, a cheerleading sort of thing, but it is material and information that is constantly pushing the space forward.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that model, I know the publication started in 2003, and the person who started it hired me. And I know that initially that was somewhat out of necessity, right? Because they didn't have the money to hire journalists. They hired a few, but they really didn't have the money to do it. Also, it started at Stanford University, which we're still a part of. And so sort of a natural inclination was to go to academics to write articles.
Mm,
Not all the articles, but many of them. And so the idea of, and my background is as a journalist, right? So you might ask, well, so why don't you have kind of a journalist model to doing SSIR where you have a staff of writers? And I won't, that is a very important function, and there are publications that do that. But our role is a little different in that it's, to bring people who have the expertise and the depth of knowledge and experience and help them take their ideas and express them in a way that people can understand. And the same people that write for us are more or less the same people that read us. So we have kind of off the charts demographics, really, that I think a lot of people are envious of. And 60 to 70% of our readers sit on the board of directors of an organization. 80% of our readers have an advanced degree. About half of them are the president, CEO, executive director of their organization, and a large percent are also the senior leadership. And that's our readers. And those are the same people that we get to write for us, those same experts. And that kind of peer-to-peer learning is, I think, it's very important because people trust their peers. They know their peers. And, to be honest, one of the tricks is get beyond what works and then talk also about what doesn't work. That's sometimes hard to get people to do. But I think it's, what was initially kind of a necessity has become a real benefit. And while we still do hire some freelance writers for some articles, because what you typically don't want is somebody writing a story about just chronicling their own organization. That's usually doesn't work well. Those we hire journalists to do. But I'd say 90+% of the articles we publish written on are by leaders in the industry, and everybody who speaks at our conferences and does our webinars is as well, that kind of group.
I'm curious, just with that, I mean, the readership as well as the contributors, I'm curious what it's like for you and the greater review team to be such like a center point in this space of the community. Like what is that experience like, or what do y'all take away from that?
Well, first of all, it's a privilege, right? I mean, that people trust us because we do, while I say peers, we are in the middle of that, and we choose which articles to publish and which ones not to publish, and we make that choice constantly. So we reject more articles than we accept by pretty big factor. And so we play a big role in kind of helping shape the conversation that goes on in the social sector. And that's, that is a big responsibility that we do take really seriously. But we So people sometimes go like, well, how do you do that, right? And so part of it comes from just experience, right? So I've been doing this 15 years. We the editors who work with me are all have deep experience as journalists and editors, so they really bring that. And then we are part of a organization called the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society at Stanford. And that organization has about 30 people, a lot of researchers, faculty who are all engaged in various aspects of like philanthropy, researching and writing about philanthropy, and civil society organizations and nonprofits. So we're constantly talking to them and getting their input. And then we're also just out there talking to people constantly. And back when you used to be able to travel, we would travel to conferences and meet with organizations and stuff. So it's, just keeping your finger on the pulse of what's going on is, it's just something you constantly have to do. It's not just sort of sitting back in a room and, like a monk, and editing an article, right? I mean, there's that part of what we do. And that's an important part because we do actually spend a lot of time editing all the articles that we publish. Mm-hmm. And I think it shows, without bragging too much, I think there's other publications out there that, also publish stuff by people in the field. And I don't think the articles read as well as ours do. That's kind of my competitive nature, right? Like we do it better, but we actually put a lot of time into that part of it. And it's appreciated by the authors. We have people, we have repeat customers. We have people who come back to us and back to us and back to us because they know that we really help them shape their ideas and how they get them out to the public, but to the audience we reach. And that's not something most people, certainly don't do that naturally. It takes, kind of experience knowing how to do that. So that's the real added value we bring to the equation.
And so you mentioned the pulse of the conversation, and you've brought up a few points already. The increasing involvement of businesses wanting to take a more serious look at more innovative social or at a minimum more sustainable models. I'm wondering, since starting in 2006 to now having your finger on the pulse for these last 14, 15 years, what are a few things that exist today, maybe outside of the pandemic world that we live in, that you're rather surprised with as to how this space of social impact or achieving social change has moved? Like what's maybe when you were back in 2006 thinking forward, what surprised you?
Well, several things. Let's just start with business. So having covered business for a long time, you'd never hear execs talk about social responsibility. They just never talk about it. And if they did philanthropy, it was something they did after they, retired. That was a traditional model, and Milton Friedman, kind of famously talked about, the fact that the role of business is to provide returns to shareholders, and that's what it is, and that's what it should always be, and that's the most efficient thing. And for years, that's what business believed, and that's what business school professors believed. And frankly, I thought that was just going to probably continue. I had hopes that people in the business world would come around, but I honestly didn't think it would mature as much as it has. And so, you have people like the Business Roundtable coming out with statements about the importance of paying attention to all stakeholders. You have BlackRock, which is the biggest, holds the most assets of any, investment group, and the head of them talking about it. You've got the B Corp movement, which, started right around the same time I joined. In fact, the founders all went to Stanford. And when they started the organization, they came around to the office and talked about what they're going to do. And I'm like, that's a great idea, but good luck. I'm not sure it's going to go. And now they have like over 3,000 companies that have gone through a very rigorous certification process to become a B Corp. And it's not just like little ones that started off with that. You've got, big organizations like Danone North America, like $6 billion in annual revenues that is a certified B Corp. So that has really surprised me, and it's been a pleasant surprise. Another thing that's kind of surprised me too is that we've moved from, I think there's a tendency to think that, experts had all the answers to solving social problems. And, and I work at Stanford University, and one of our roles is to kind of bring the worlds of academia together with the worlds of practitioners. And I would say, in academia, there's often kind of a very sort of snobby opinion about, the rest of the world. Like, well, we know everything, right? It's all good, if only people would do what we've figured out. And I think, in the world of, when you're talking about like solving poverty and homelessness and education stuff, a lot of the practices and ideas came out of kind of an academic and heavily research-based world. Those things are super important. I don't mean to imply that they're not. There's been a lot of advances in the behavioral sciences that are hugely critical. But I think there often was an assumption that, we could just drop into any situation with these ideas and expertise and just create a program and then it's going to work. Well, I think there's been an evolution over this, last 15 years that we've seen. I mean, the whole notion of human-centered design, right, is something that, back in 2006 was really kind of pioneered by the tech industry. Like the mouse, was known for the people who designed that came out of that world, in the Mac and stuff. But it never really been applied to social problems. But now it's like widely done, engaging with beneficiaries, listening to people, in communities. These are things that just really weren't done much before. And I think that explains one of the reasons why despite a lot of money and a lot of effort, there wasn't as much change as we would have hoped for, because oftentimes they didn't get the buy-in of the communities they were working with, right? And there's a lot of local expertise that's often just as important, but overlooked. And so, one of the things that I think has been great is bringing those two worlds together. I think they need each other, right? It's not as if like people in the community can just instantly solve all their problems. And there is a body of knowledge that we've learned about how to do things that can be useful, but it's also the case that you just can't, drop a program into some place and just think it's going to work. So that's a second thing that I think has been a pleasant surprise. And then the third thing I'll mention, and there are others, but the third thing is how global this phenomenon has become of social innovation. If you go back in history, the whole notion of charities and nonprofits. I mean, very famous book, Democracy in America, we talked about like, it's amazing in the United States, right? There's all these civil society organizations that exist outside of the state and the church, right? That really do an incredible amount of stuff, right? And there's whole institutions, and the churches had freedom to do stuff, and you had the whole history of philanthropy, led by Carnegie and Rockefeller. A lot of that was really coming out of the U.S. and the UK. It's kind of an Anglo thing for a lot of different reasons. But it's really now become a global phenomenon for, many reasons. But you now see this model being used all over, throughout Europe, in Latin America, Asia, Africa. And I think it's really, terrific. And like I said, or I think I said, I worked at Forbes magazine. And when I was there, they would do the list of the wealthiest people in the world, and they still do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like, you want to, if you're wealthy, you want to be on that list, right? It's like Donald Trump was always trying to get on that list. And that still exists. But they've also begun, some years ago, doing a list of the people who gave away the most money in Forbes. That was the Forbes list. That's kind of remarkable. And as a result of things like that, and Bill Gates, who, is just an iconic figure amongst entrepreneurs worldwide. The fact that he left Microsoft pretty early and is seriously engaged in philanthropy, right? He's turned all the energy he used to put into world domination of, getting Microsoft everywhere, to philanthropy. And then through the Giving Pledge has really become, made that a thing to do. If you're a wealthy person anywhere in the world, mm-hmm. You have to think seriously about, wow, it's like all my peers are, that I admire on done the Giving Pledge. Maybe I should, right? And that is kind of a new thing, because, if you look at, flaunting your wealth, it's not just that's something that Americans have done quite well too, but it's, it's really something that, how big a yacht can I get, right? And again, it's not that that's gone away, but I think many wealthy people around the world are now looking at philanthropy as also something important. And the nonprofit, model itself and social innovation, and I think is a world phenomenon. We actually have, and I can talk about this later, but we publish a Chinese language edition and a Korean language edition. We have an agreement to launch an Arabic language edition. And we're within a few weeks of signing agreements to do a Spanish language edition. And so I travel around the world and talk to people, and I can have the exact same conversations in Tel Aviv or in Singapore or in Seoul or Beijing. I mean, Mexico City, it's true. And I had never really thought that's a surprise to me. And it's a good surprise.
Mm. And so, I mean, those are certainly all positive trends. I'm wondering where do you feel like the gap still exists? Like where are some of the leverage points with all these positive things happening, looking still at the eye for the critical, where do we need to go still to tackle some of these serious issues that we have in front of us?
So, obviously big problems still exist, right? Wouldn't be too hard to go through some of these, climate change, growing inequality, racial injustice, and, one can point to improvements, of course, but fundamentally these things have not been solved. So how do we solve why is that? I think one issue is that, I've been talking a lot about philanthropy and nonprofits. They're very important, but to be honest, this kind of comes back to my, kind of socialist inclinations. Government plays a huge role. And if you don't have governments helping improve society or believe that government can play a role in doing that, these problems are not going to get fixed, right? I mean, there's not enough. Well, you could take, all the wealth that exists amongst, the billionaires and apply it to, poverty, and it's like not even a dent, right? You need to have governments doing this, and unfortunately, I'd say beginning with kind of the Reagan Thatcher era, there's been a growing distrust of government, and it's worldwide, honestly. We see it in the US. This whole, without getting into the pandemic, one of the reasons that it's not working is because people don't trust the government, right? And so, I think that's a big problem and there's, I'd say, like kind of an ideological battle going on in the world right now. Certainly you can see that in the upcoming election, like the Democratic Party, has, I think, articulates pretty well. The government needs to play an important role, and Trump is articulating a very opposite vision. Same thing's going on in Europe. I'd say in Latin America, you're seeing similar things. So that's one thing that we'll just have to see how that plays out. But that's, I think, one big fail. The idea of growing economic inequality. I mean, it's true that there's been, say in China, huge numbers of people that were living in abject poverty who now are living pretty good lives. There's still many people who aren't. But just as important, China has more billionaires now than any country in the world, right? In a communist country, pretty ironic. But it's not just China, it's the US, et cetera. So, everyone's read these stats, but, there's a large numbers of people in the US who are $500 away from, being on the street, right? And I think we're seeing that now with the pandemic, right? It's very stark, right? And thankfully, the government did step in and provide some economic relief to people, through the form of, these checks that went out to everyone that makes less than whatever, 100,000, and then tacking on federal money to unemployment checks. But kind of Band-Aid approach, really. I mean, I think we really, how are we going to solve that growing economic inequality? I mean, I think unions are important. And there's kind of a growing recognition of that. And it's also important, what kind of tax structure you have matters. And that goes back to kind of government issues. But I think that's a big fail that we have to address. Because again, nonprofits and philanthropy by itself can't fix that. And then the third thing that's, big fail that's become quite obvious is, racism and racial injustice. That's particularly true in the US, but it's not only in the US. And this is something in the US, right? I mean, it goes back to the beginning of the country history. I was an American Studies major when I was in college. And racism many people have become aware of it in regards to African Americans, but indigenous people suffered it and continue to suffer it hugely. And again, it's not just you look in Latin America, I mean, it takes a little slightly different form, but you go to Mexico, they have their own racial, status. The lighter skin you are, the more status that has. If you're an indigenous person in Mexico, you're like at the bottom of the rung. Now, it's not, they didn't really have slavery in the same way we did. I mean, there are differences, but they suffer from that. Brazil suffers from that. India, the caste system there. So, and Europe, which used to be somewhat insulated, has had huge numbers of immigration coming in from Africa, primarily in Caribbean and Asia. And, racism is reared its ugly head in Europe too. So that is a huge fail. And I'd say, with these final two, racial injustice, racism, and income inequality, I think, and I'll say even with government, go out on a limb, I think this pandemic has been, the way I think about it is kind of like a pressure test on society. And like, how does society deal with something that is really has to be addressed socially? Well, without getting into it too much, the U.S. is failing in so many ways, but there's a growing awareness of it, right?
Yeah.
I think, certainly with racial inequality, I think even around, income, many of the people used to be first responders meant, cops and firemen. Well, now the people are talking about, people that work, in nursing homes, people that work in food service, right? I mean, and these are people that, in companies, some businesses are even giving these people bonuses, right? And I think that the status of those jobs has risen in people's minds, which is very important and kind of a precursor to, I think, other kinds of change going on. So on the one hand, it's easy to kind of get depressed about all the stuff going on. But I tend to be a bit of an optimist, which is why I do what I do, right? I mean, because we're all about finding solutions. And so I think there's another way of looking at all this is like, wow, it's like, yes, these things are bad, but it's now staring everybody in the face. And I do think it's setting the stage for some really big changes in society for the better.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, anecdotally or as well, as you're tracking trends nationally, I've noticed very similar things in healthcare. For one, was one thing in just conversations with peers that I've noticed people's perspective shift. We're like, oh yeah, it makes complete sense that healthcare is not attached to someone's job. And I'm like,
Yeah,
oh,
especially when you have like so many people laid off, then they
yeah.
have like, I guess what, you got no health insurance.
Right. And that's for me, I was like, oh, that's an interesting, it took this moment for that to magnify that particular thing. I'm like, that seems significant. Like with this friend or whomever it was, I'm like, I'm not sure I would imagine you saying that, previously, but because of the circumstances, it's provided that. And so I guess some gifts in this prolonged suffering in the moment, not this crisis not being one that's acute, but dragging out as long as it has
Yeah.
and will.
And uh, I do think this election is kind of going to be a mandate on many of these questions. I mean, it's all, it's not as if everyone gets a vote, because we know that everyone doesn't get a vote in this country, unfortunately. But I do think it's a hugely important election, but also for the reason of like, what do we as a society want to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where are we going to go? I am hopeful, but also scared. But I think, I'm hopeful that we're going to choose the right path.
Same, but not without that underlying anxiety that.
Oh yeah.
Well, Eric, I'm curious then, what for Stanford Social Innovation Review particularly, what's on the immediate horizon for y'all with such significant moments, the election coming up and the year beyond? What's going on for y'all?
Well, fortunately, we were a little concerned because, subscribing to SSIR, we like to think it's the most important thing you can do, but of course it's not necessarily. And, with so many nonprofit organizations being hurt financially, we were a little worried. Would we see a drop in subscriptions? Would we see a drop in people being willing to pay for webinars, attend conferences, things like that? And actually, we haven't. So one way to look at that is that you could say the information we provide is more important than ever right now. That's what I like to believe. So fortunately, I think we are weathering this pretty well. Our budget's going to be pretty close to what we'd expected. The one little hit is that in-person conferences were a pretty big piece of our business model, and I can't do that.
Yeah.
So we've moved to online. We're doing them virtually, but you can't charge as much for a virtual event as you could for an in-person event. So that's been a bit of a hit on our revenues, but then the expenses are down. But basically, we're doing okay financially. So the one thing that I mentioned that we have the Chinese and Korean language edition. One thing that we've been really doing a big push on the last couple of years is to find partners around the world who we can work with to bring SSIR's content out to all the people that don't read English, of whom there are many, many, many. So we are actively doing that right now. So I mentioned we just signed an agreement with a group to do an Arabic language edition. That hasn't started, but that's going to take some work from us as well. But we're super excited about that. Same thing with the Spanish language edition, because the idea for that is that it'll be pan-Latin, hard to say Latin America because Brazil is Portuguese, sure. But most of Latin, Central America, and Spain, as well as some of the people in the U.S. We're in talks. In fact, later today, I'm going to be on a call with a group in Japan who we've been talking to for the last 8 months or so about doing a Japanese language edition. So that is our one big thing that we're trying to do now. Because like I said, this phenomena is global, and a lot of the problems are global in nature. And so helping, this peer-to-peer learning that goes on, you can't really talk about peer-to-peer learning if you're leaving out, I don't know what the number is, 75% of the world's population that doesn't speak English, right? So that is a big thing for us. The other thing that we're doing a lot of is really trying to, do better with our online presence. And I think we do that well now. But for example, I'm talking to you on a podcast show. We did podcasts when I first got there, and we had a pretty big podcast channel. And I'll just be honest, we sort of let it lapse. We still produce some stuff, but not as much as we should. So, and podcasts, talk about another surprise. Podcast like taken off, right? Who would have thought? Yeah. Really. But our philosophy has always been that people learn in different ways, and they liked, and so we don't just do the written word. We do podcasts, but not as much as we should. Webinars, virtual events, I think will be another thing, moving more to doing things online. So in-person events are great. There's a lot of things to be said for them. I don't think we'll stop doing them, but when you do things online, you can instantly reach everybody in the world, right? There might be some time shifting involved. Maybe you record it and they can listen to it later at their convenience, but it really opens it up to a much bigger audience. It's not like we didn't know that, but I think it's now we've just become very aware of it.
Yeah.
Both the opportunity and what the fact that we're not doing as much as we should be doing. So those are two areas, I'd say, becoming more global and really doubling down more on online.
Excellent. Well, I should note that I think you have a COVID era subscriber out of our Grow Ensemble team here. So I think it was February when we started our subscription. So maybe just about, yeah. So maybe that's why your numbers are still looking good. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we have online, as soon as the COVID thing started, we jumped on trying to publish articles on it. I don't know what we're up to now, 30 or something, which doesn't sound huge, if you compare to the New York Times, but that's something that, we've been directly addressing, in addition to all the usual stuff that we do that's more of kind of an evergreen nature. So hopefully maybe one of those articles attracted you, or maybe they attracted some other people.
Definitely. Well, Eric, I really appreciate the time. You mind a couple quick hit questions before we tidy up here?
Okay. This is the rapid round.
Yes, that's what we're heading into. So first, what's been maybe a book that's really impacted you recently, or something you always come back to that you'd like to recommend as it relates to the space of social change and social impact?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I actually was thinking I should. 'Cause to be honest, I spend my whole day reading intellectual stuff, articles. So at night, I read junk novels. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but yeah, I don't have a specific book that I would recommend, unfortunately. So
that's okay. I'd be curious to know what other kind of media are you consuming, or like what might you recommend there?
Well, I've always been a huge fan of the New York Times, and this is not for political reasons, just like they are the, best, they do the best job of, reporting on topics right now. I think they have a huge staff, and so I read them, and the Wall Street Journal. I also look at, the Guardian, because I want to get sometimes the Financial Times to get a perspective from Europe. I also, of course, read New Yorker, Atlantic, like those. Also National Geographic. I've been, ever since I was a little kid when my parents got it, but they really segued into some interesting stuff. They're tackling many more social issues than they used to. I don't know if you read it, but in addition to just having great photographs,
Yeah.
I've done photography since I was young. They have really engaging and challenging articles.
Hmm. Excellent. Good recommendations. And the next one, are there any particular daily routines or kind of morning habits that you feel like you have to stay committed to?
Well, I've tried to develop some new ones. I'm actually doing this podcast from New Jersey, and I'm going to the beach every morning and doing like a 3.5 mile walk,
There we go.
taking advantage of the time shift because pretty much most of the people that work for me are out in California. So if I get up at 6:30, I know they're in bed. So I've got several hours that I can do my own thing. So going out and walking, I mean, I think these days, given that we're all sort of locked in, exercise is important. I think the obvious, because I think for people involved in social change, it's easy to get really tied up in the work.
Mm.
Happens to me all the time. But you have to take care of yourself. Girls, you won't be able to engage in the work over the long run.
Mm.
So I do go do the walk and start doing more stretching and physical exercise. So those things, and then I do go up in the morning and I check the news because I need to know. Even though we don't do news, I have to know what's going on in the world. So those are my morning routines.
Perfect. And have there been any particular companies or nonprofit organizations or otherwise that have particularly inspired you recently? Any folks that you might think are worthy of a little plug right now?
Mm-hmm. I think I've been impressed with Give Directly. They've when they first started, I was a little suspicious, but I think they've really become an important vehicle for, particularly during this pandemic period, for people who want to get money in individuals' hands. Which isn't to say that organizations developing programs and services aren't important, but right now there's a lot of people that they don't really need help in knowing how to live a good life. It's like they need a job or they need money.
Yeah.
Like simple as that. And Give Directly, that's kind of been their philosophy. And they've, I think they've done a really good job of stepping up to become a real vehicle for wealthy people or others, donors that have money and want to get it into the hands and finding, interesting ways of getting into people's hands. And I think, kind of tied into that, the basic income model. Yang did a good job of publicizing that during his candidacy, but there's been some efforts like in Stockton, California, to do this kind of as a test case. And I think, again, the basic income model is basically give people money and do it on an ongoing basis. So I think they've been, that model I think has done pretty well. The B Corp movement, I mentioned them before, but I think the people running that have done a pretty incredible job at building support for that movement. And recently they've begun doing it. So it's run by a group called B Lab, and they're a nonprofit, and they've recently made a big effort to try to figure out how to take their model to large corporations. Because honestly, it was not feasible to think that a huge corporation is going to go through all the stuff that you have to do to become a certified B Corp. So they're sort of doing a B Corp light, if you want to call it that, as a way to kind of get corporations to begin doing some of those things. And in fact, in our next plug for our next issue that comes out in mid-August, our cover story is on that issue about how B Lab has kind of adjusted its model to make it something that large corporations can do as well.
Hmm. Perfect. Yeah, and I mean we're pretty admirable here of the B Corporation movement. We're working through the certification ourselves.
Oh, you are?
Yeah, for Grow Ensemble, and it is rigorous. That is that's for sure. But
Has it made you change anything that you do?
certainly. I mean, at a minimum, it like there's a lot of documentation that it involves. So there's that. It's like tracking how much of your work is pro bono or volunteer hours that you're doing from. I mean, we're all remote and distributed. And so even the most basic of like, what's your kind of green home office policy, whether you're providing people their own resources to be able to achieve that or, giving them clear prescription and instruction. A lot of small incremental changes for sure. But yeah, it's a learning experience in itself. And they've done a good job of providing a lot of supplementary resources. We're switching our bank as an example, like a lot of little things bit by bit. So it's been.
I think that's one of the ideas behind it. I mean, they would love it if everyone just came in and could check all the boxes and we're good. But the reality is that a lot of organizations haven't thought through all these questions, right?
Yeah.
Like, who are you banking with, right? And it's the process of going through the certification steps is itself a learning process, and you make some changes. You don't need to, and nor would anyone make all the changes. But I think it's that by itself is really terrific.
Yeah, it kind of feels like we're going through a bit of a course as we go, because there are some questions we're like, oh, okay, I don't, where do we start? But luckily, it's a very generous and open community too. So other B Corps are very willing to offer support.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's what I've heard. I have no experience doing it myself, but.
Well, Eric, last question before we finish up here. Any sort of parting bits of advice or asks for an audience of social entrepreneurs, executive directors, and nonprofits, CEOs of purpose-driven businesses?
Well, of course, one ask would be, if you don't already know SSIR, please check us out. Where most of the articles that we publish that are available online are free. So it's not a big commitment. We don't have a paywall that everything like the Wall Street Journal, where everything's behind it. Some of our materials are, but not all of it. So, but it's not just come and read. Like, we were talking about earlier, it is a peer-to-peer learning platform. So we are not, I may have scared people away when I said that we reject more articles than we publish, but we do rely on the community to share their ideas with our audience. So we have some lines that are up on the homepage they're on every page on our website at the bottom. And I would encourage anybody who is interested in writing about the work that they do, and importantly, the lessons they've learned that they can share with other people. We're coming from a diverse community, working in different fields. We would love to get people to do that. I'm always out beating the bushes and asking people to write for us. So that's my one big ask.
Excellent. All right. We'll make sure everything Stanford Social Innovation Review is linked up at our show notes at growensemble.com. Thanks, Eric.
Well, great. Thank you, Corey. And again, thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast. I've really enjoyed it.
You bet.